They say the lantern guides the lost, but here...
10 days. That's what the math said. And the math was the only thing left that wasn't lying. My name is Dale Macon. I'm 44 years old, and I teach woodshop and general construction at Whiteside High School in Morrison, Illinois, a town of 1,700 people sitting in the crease between cornfields and the Rock River. So flat you can watch your dog run away for 3 days. I'm not a prepper. I'm not ex-military. I don't own body armor or night vision goggles or a bunker full of freeze-dried beef stroganoff. What I own is a table saw, a welder, a truck full of lumber, and 22 years of teaching teenagers how to measure twice and cut once. That, the county health department email that arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was grading sophomore birdhouse projects. The email wasn't meant for me. It was a forwarded chain. Someone in the district office had sent it to all staff as an informational attachment, the kind of bureaucratic reflex that treats catastrophe like a memo item. Attached was a PDF, a map of confirmed infection zones, overlaid with spread rate projections from the Illinois Department of Public Health. The data was 4 days old. The methodology was standard epidemiological modeling. Radial expansion adjusted for population density, transportation corridors, and geographic barriers. I'd seen models like this before, not because I'm an epidemiologist, but because I spent 6 years on the County Flood Mitigation Board, reading FEMA inundation maps and arguing about levee setbacks. I know how to read a spread map. And what this one said: once you trace the red gradient west from Chicago through DeKalb and Dixon, was that the infection wavefront would reach Lee County in 10 days, give or take 2, depending on whether the I-88 corridor accelerated transmission the way the model assumed. Give or take 2, so 8 to 12. Call it 10 because round numbers keep you honest. I sat in my shop classroom with sawdust on my sleeves and looked at that map for a long time. The TV in the teacher's lounge had been running cable news for 3 days. Shaky helicopter footage of National Guard blockades on the Dan Ryan, a hospital in Rockford with plywood over its windows, a press conference where a woman from the CDC used the phrase, atypical behavioral contagion, 11 times without once saying the word that everyone else was already using. The news was noise. The map was signal. I called my ex-wife, Teresa, in Sterling. No answer. I called my daughter, Kaylee, who was 19 and living in an apartment in DeKalb, with 2 roommates and a lease she couldn't afford. She answered on the 6th ring. "Dad, I can see them from my window." My hand went still on the desk. "How many?" "I don't know. A lot. They came down Lincoln Highway an hour ago. The police tried to block the intersection at Annie Glidden and... Dad, the police are gone now." "Are your doors locked?" "Yes." "Windows? 2nd floor?" "Yes." "Kaylee, listen to me. Do not open your door for anyone. Fill every container you have with water right now. I'm coming to get you." "Dad, they're saying on the news not to drive toward..." "I'm coming to get you." I drove east on Route 30 in my F250 with a pry bar on the passenger seat and a feeling in my chest like someone had poured concrete between my ribs. DeKalb was 43 miles from Morrison. Normally 40 minutes. That day, I made it in 27 because the road was empty in my direction. Everyone fleeing west, a river of headlights in the oncoming lanes, and me cutting against the current like a salmon with a death wish. I found Kaylee's apartment complex dark. Power was out on the whole block. I banged on her door, and she opened it with a kitchen knife in her hand, and mascara tracked down both cheeks. Behind her, one of her roommates, a girl named Sophie I'd met once at move-in day, was sitting on the couch holding a baseball bat and crying silently. "Get your bag," I said. "Sophie, you too. We're leaving in 2 minutes." On the stairs going down, we saw our first one. It was standing in the lobby, facing the mailboxes, motionless. A man in a FedEx uniform. His head turned toward us with a mechanical smoothness that made Sophie stop breathing. I put myself between the girls and the lobby. raised the pry bar, and walked us backward up the stairs and out the fire exit. We were in the truck and moving before it reached the parking lot. The drive back to Morrison took 3 hours. Route 30 was now clogged in both directions. The westbound evacuation had stalled somewhere near Rochelle, and eastbound was accumulating the debris of abandoned vehicles and accidents. I took county roads, 2-lane blacktops through Shabona, Pawpaw, and Sublette, past farms where the lights were on and the driveways were full, and the faces in the windows tracked our truck with expressions I recognized from tornado season. The watchful paralysis of people who know something is coming but haven't yet decided what to do about it. Sophie sat in the back seat and didn't speak for the entire drive. Kaylee sat beside me with her hand on my arm. Not gripping, just resting there, maintaining contact. She'd stopped crying before we left the parking lot. My daughter processes fear the way I process lumber. She measures it, squares it, and puts it somewhere she can use it later. I'd always admired that about her. I'd never expected it to be a survival trait. We arrived in Morrison at 10:30 at night. My house sits on 4 acres at the edge of town. Not isolated, but buffered by a hayfield on the south side and the county road on the north. The house itself is a 1940s bungalow that I've been renovating since the divorce, which means it's half finished in the way that all divorced men's houses are half finished. The kitchen is beautiful and the bathroom doesn't have a door. But beside the house is my shop, 40 by 60 feet, steel-framed, insulated, with a concrete slab, overhead door, power, and every tool I've accumulated in 2 decades of teaching people how to build things. The shop was the asset, not the house. My neighbor, Frank Hubbard, was on his porch when we pulled in. Frank is 67, retired from John Deere, lives alone since his wife passed in 2019. He grows the best tomatoes in Lee County and owns more firearms than the Morrison Police Department, though that last part isn't saying much. "Dale," he called across the 30 yards between our properties. "You been east?" "DeKalb." "And?" "It's gone, Frank." He absorbed that. Frank doesn't react quickly to information. He takes it in, places it somewhere inside the vast warehouse of his experience, and responds when he's found the right shelf. After a moment, he walked across to my driveway with a flashlight and a lever-action .45-70 that he carried the way other men carry umbrellas. "How long?" he asked. 10 days, maybe less." "To here." He looked at my shop, then at the house, then at the field. "You're going to build something." It wasn't a question. Frank had watched me build the shop, build the kitchen, build a pergola for Teresa that she never sat under because we split before the stain dried. He knew that my response to any problem was to construct something. "I'm going to build a shelter," I said. "In the shop. The steel frame is solid, the slab is 8 inches of reinforced concrete, and I have materials for barriers, sight lines, and interior compartments. I can make that building survivable." "For how many?" The question stopped me. I'd been thinking about 3. Me, Kaylee, Sophie, maybe 4 with Frank. A defensible box for a handful of people, sealed tight, supplied for weeks. "I don't know yet," I said. "You're going to get more than you planned for," Frank said. "You build something that works, people will find out. This town talks, and scared people look for the person who looks like they have a plan." He was right. I knew he was right. And I resented his rightness because it introduced a variable I couldn't control. Other people, their needs, their panic, their judgment. Into a problem I wanted to solve with wood and steel and math. "Frank, I need to start tonight." "I know you do." He shifted the rifle to his other hand. "I'll watch. You build." Kaylee and Sophie went into the house. I turned on the shop lights, opened the overhead door, and stood in the center of the concrete slab, surrounded by table saws and drill presses and stacked lumber. And I did what I'd taught 1,000 students to do before they picked up a single tool. I drew a plan. By midnight, I had a layout. By 2 in the morning, I had a materials list. By dawn, I was cutting the first sheets of 3/4-inch plywood for interior barrier walls, and the sound of the saw was the first honest thing I'd heard in days. A clean, controllable sound that meant progress instead of collapse. Day 1 of 10. Word spread the way Frank predicted, not through any announcement, but through the ambient information network of a small town where everyone knows the sound of everyone else's table saw. By noon on day 2, I had visitors. The first was Renee Villanueva, who taught biology at Whiteside and lived 3 blocks west. She arrived in running shoes and a North Face jacket carrying a first aid kit and a printed copy of the same health department map I'd received. She'd done her own math. Her numbers matched mine. "I told my students yesterday that school was canceled indefinitely," she said, standing in the shop doorway while I bolted a plywood partition to the steel frame. Half of them already knew. The other half didn't believe me. The ones who believed me went home and started packing. The ones who didn't believe me went to lunch. "What are you asking, Renee?" "I'm asking if you have room." Behind Renee came her neighbor, a man named Gil Mathers, mid-50s, divorced, worked at the grain elevator on Route 78. Gil was thick-shouldered, quiet, and carried himself with the guarded energy of someone who'd spent his whole life being underestimated and had long ago stopped correcting people about it. He didn't ask for room. He asked what I needed hauled. By the end of day 2, I had 7 people. Kaylee, Sophie, Frank, Renee, Gil, and 2 more. A married couple, Tom and Vera Spaulding, who owned the hardware store on Main Street and arrived in Tom's van loaded with supplies: plywood, screws, hinges, padlocks, tarps, rope, duct tape, and 3 5-gallon buckets of exterior latex paint that I couldn't imagine needing, but accepted because you don't turn away a hardware store owner during an apocalypse. Tom was 58, competent, and accustomed to being the most knowledgeable person in any room that involved physical materials. He looked at my layout and said, "Your sight lines are wrong." "Excuse me?" "The barrier walls. You've got them perpendicular to the shop walls, which means anyone inside can only see straight ahead. You need angled baffles, 45 degrees, so you can see down the corridor from multiple positions." He was right. I knew he was right the way I'd known Frank was right about the population problem. And I felt the same resentment, which I swallowed because resentment is not a building material. "Show me," I said. And Tom picked up a pencil and redrew my partition layout on the back of a paint bucket label. We built Tom's design. It was better than mine. The angular baffles created overlapping sight lines and eliminated blind corners. The shop began to take shape as a series of connected chambers rather than a single open space. Sleeping quarters in the back, supply storage along the north wall, a common area in the center, and a fortified observation point at the overhead door that could be sealed from inside. Kaylee organized the sleeping area. She didn't ask permission or wait for instruction. She took measurements, counted bodies, calculated square footage per person, and arranged the space with the logical efficiency of someone who'd grown up watching her father solve spatial problems. Sophie followed her lead, contributing a quiet physical competence that surprised me. The girl who'd been crying on the couch in DeKalb was now hauling plywood sheets with steady hands. Frank maintained the perimeter. He walked the property line every 2 hours, day and night, with the 4570 and a thermos of coffee. He reported what he saw without editorializing. Vehicles on the county road, mostly westbound. A helicopter, military, heading southeast. A column of smoke visible from the direction of Dixon, 15 miles east. The smoke was new. On the evening of day 2, Renee turned on a portable radio in the common area. The emergency broadcast system was cycling a recorded message. "Shelter in place, avoid contact, await further instruction." Between cycles, a local AM station out of Rockford was still live, manned by what sounded like a single operator reading updates from a paper printout. Dixon had reported its first confirmed cases. The National Guard was establishing a perimeter along the Fox River, 50 miles east. The perimeter was described as fluid. Fluid means failing, Gil said. He'd served in the guard 20 years ago. He didn't elaborate. I stood in my shop that night. My shop, which was becoming something else, a shared structure, a collective project, a vessel for lives I hadn't planned to carry. And I looked at the 9 remaining days on my mental clock and tried to calculate whether the walls going up would be enough. Day 3 brought the first real argument. It started with water. The house had a well and an electric pump, which meant water only flowed when the power was on. The grid was still active in Morrison, but the reliability was degrading. Brownouts twice on day 2, a full 30-minute outage at midnight. I'd planned to fill every available container from the tap and supplement with the rain barrels I'd installed during the renovation. Total stored water, if we were disciplined. Enough for 7 people for 3 weeks. But we were now 9, and the math had shifted. Tom Spaulding proposed rationing immediately. Half a gallon per person per day for drinking, another half for cooking and sanitation. It was aggressive but sustainable. Renee disagreed. Half a gallon for drinking isn't enough if people are doing physical labor in an enclosed space. You'll get dehydration symptoms by day 4. And then your workforce degrades. Then we reduce the labor rotation, Tom said. We can't reduce the labor rotation. The east wall isn't reinforced, the observation post isn't finished, and we don't have barrier coverage on the south side. We need every hand working full days for the next week. Tom looked at Renee with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to being contradicted by a high school biology teacher. Then we need fewer people. The words landed in the common area like a dropped blade. Nobody moved. Sophie, who was sitting on a supply crate sorting screws into coffee cans, stopped her hands. Gil, leaning against the north wall with his arms crossed, shifted his weight forward onto his toes, a subtle change that I read as preparation. Nobody's leaving, I said. I didn't say anyone should leave, Tom said. I said we need fewer people. Which means we stop taking more. Door closes. Tonight. The door was never open, I said. People showed up. And if more show up tomorrow? We deal with it tomorrow. That's not a plan, Dale. That's a prayer. He wasn't wrong. I was deferring the population question because I didn't want to answer it. And Tom was forcing the issue because he understood something I was avoiding. Resources are finite. Time is finite. And every additional person subtracts from both. He was thinking like a man who ran a business. Inputs, outputs, margins. I was thinking like a man who ran a classroom. If a kid shows up, you teach them. Kaylee diffused the moment by redirecting the energy. We can increase water storage by 40% if we line the truck bed with a tarp and use it as a collection basin. It rained last Thursday. It'll rain again. Dad, do you have food-grade sealant? I did. We built the collection basin that afternoon. It was an elegant solution. My daughter's practical mind finding the resource inside the constraint. Tom watched her work and said nothing. But I saw him recalculate something behind his eyes. That evening, the radio operator in Rockford went silent. Mid-sentence, mid-update, the voice simply stopped and was replaced by the automated emergency broadcast loop. None of us commented. Renee turned the radio off and set it on the shelf beside the first aid kit. Face down, as though laying something to rest. After dark, Frank reported movement on the county road that wasn't vehicular. He described it from the porch in his flat, measured tone. 3 figures, heading west on foot, not walking right. One of them stopped at the Miller Place driveway and stood there for about 10 minutes, then moved on. Not walking right how? I asked. Smooth, like they're on a track. No arm swing, no weight shift, just forward. Day 3, 7 days remaining. 3 figures on the county road, passing through, not stopping. Not yet. I went back to the shop and picked up a drill. The south wall wasn't going to reinforce itself. On day 4, Ray Purcell arrived. He came in a Chevy Suburban with a cracked windshield and 2 children in the back seat, his daughter Mia, who was 7, and his son Jace, who was 10. His wife was not with them. He parked in my driveway and sat behind the wheel for a full minute before opening the door. And when he stepped out, I saw a man who had been hollowed. Not injured, not panicked, emptied. He looked at my shop with its plywood barriers and angled baffles and reinforced door, and his face didn't register hope or relief. It registered arrival. The expression of someone who has been moving for a long time and has simply stopped. "Lisa didn't make it," he said to me, the way you'd report a road closure. Flat, informational, already past it. Except he wasn't past it. His hands were trembling so badly that he couldn't undo his daughter's seatbelt. Kaylee reached past him and freed Mia, lifting her out of the Suburban with the competence of someone who used to babysit every weekend in high school. I knew Ray, not well. He worked at the Farm Bureau office in town, the kind of quiet, institutional man who mows his lawn on Saturdays and coaches Little League in the spring. His wife, Lisa, taught second grade at Morrison Elementary. Kaylee had been in her class, Ray told us later. Not that day, not voluntarily, but 3 days later when the story finally fell out of him like a tooth that had been loose too long. That Lisa had been bitten while loading the car in their garage. She'd told him to take the kids and go. She'd told him from the other side of the garage door she'd already closed between them. He'd stood on the driveway and listened to her breathing change through the steel panel, and then he'd driven here because he didn't know where else to go. 11 people now, 2 of them children. Tom Spaulding didn't say a word when Ray arrived. He didn't have to. His silence was a sentence. We absorbed the Purcells into the shop. Mia was withdrawn but functional. She stayed within arm's reach of Kaylee and ate what was put in front of her and slept when the lights went off. Jace was watchful and vocal, asking questions about the construction that were surprisingly technical for a 10-year-old. Why plywood instead of steel? Why angle the walls? What's the load rating on the overhead door? I answered every question because teaching is what I do, and because a child asking how things work is a child who hasn't given up on the idea that things can work. Ray was the problem. He didn't break down. That would have been legible, manageable. Renee had a background in crisis counseling from her years as a school advisor, and she was prepared for grief. What Ray did instead was more difficult. He organized. He inserted himself into the workflow with a manic industriousness that ran 14 hours a day, taking on every physical task he could find. Hauling, drilling, lifting, stacking, without rest, without conversation, without acknowledging that anything had happened to him. He worked the way an engine runs without oil, fast, hot, and progressively destroying itself from inside. On day 5, he dropped a sheet of plywood on Vera Spaulding's foot. It was an accident. Fatigue, not malice. Vera's foot wasn't broken, but the bruise was severe, and she couldn't put weight on it for 2 days. Tom cornered me in the observation post. He's dangerous. He's exhausted. He's not sleeping, Dale. I can hear him at night. He walks the shop. He picks things up and puts them down. He talks to himself. He lost his wife 4 days ago. I understand that. I sympathize with that. But his children are in this space, and so is everyone else. And a man who can't control his body is a liability we can't afford. What do you want me to do, Tom? Put him outside. I want you to lead. Make a decision. Set a rule. Mandatory rest, supervised shifts, something. You built this place, and people are looking to you. That was the first time someone had explicitly framed me as the leader, and the weight of it landed on my shoulders like a physical load. I hadn't asked for authority. I'd built a shop, drawn a plan, and started cutting wood. People had gathered around the activity and assumed it was leadership. It wasn't. It was carpentry. But Tom's demand required an answer, and the answer required me to confront Ray. And confronting a grieving man about his grief is not a task that any amount of woodworking skill prepares you for. I found Ray on the roof. He'd climbed a ladder I didn't know he'd moved and was sitting on the peak of the shop, staring east toward the county road where the horizon glowed faintly orange. Dixon was burning. We'd seen the plume for 2 days, but tonight it was brighter, closer, and the wind carried a smell that mixed ash with something biological and sweet that none of us wanted to identify. Ray. He didn't turn. I can see them from up here, on the road, more than last night. I climbed up and sat beside him. The metal roof was cold through my jeans. The night was clear, mid-October Illinois, temperature dropping toward frost. From the peak, I could see the county road in both directions, lit by a half moon. Frank's reports had been accurate. There were figures on the road, maybe a dozen, moving west in that smooth, rail-like gait he'd described. But they were passing through, not turning, not approaching. "You need to sleep," I said. "I sleep. You don't. Tom hears you walking at night. You dropped a sheet on Vera today." I apologized to Vera. This isn't about apologies. It's about function. You're not functioning. He turned toward me. And in the moonlight, I saw his face clearly for the first time since he'd arrived. The hollowness I'd seen in the driveway had deepened into something architectural. The bones of his face more prominent, the eyes set deeper, the skin drawn tight. Grief had remodeled him the way water remodels limestone. Slowly, irreversibly, by removing material. "Function," he repeated. "You want me to function. I want you to be alive in 2 weeks. Your kids need you alive. My kids need their mother." He said it without self-pity, without drama. A statement of structural fact. The foundation was cracked, and he was reporting the crack. "Lisa made a choice so you could be here. Don't waste it by working yourself into a collapse." It was the wrong thing to say. I knew it as the words left my mouth. Evoking Lisa as a motivational device, using a dead woman's sacrifice as a management tool, was the kind of thing a boss says, not a friend, not a human being standing on a roof next to another human being whose world has been amputated. Ray's face closed like a door. "Don't talk about Lisa," he said. "Not to make me do something, not ever. I'm sorry. You're managing me, Dale. I can feel it. Everyone in that shop is managing me. Renee with her counseling voice. Tom with his inventory clipboard. Kaylee carrying Mia around like she's already decided needs a replacement. Everyone's decided I'm the problem, and they're all working around me. Nobody thinks you're the problem. Then stop treating me like one." He climbed down the ladder. I sat on the roof alone and looked east at the glow and the figures on the road, and felt the first fissure in the assumption I'd been operating under since day one. That the threat was out there, and the work was in here, and the boundary between them was a wall I could build. Ray wasn't a threat. Ray was a wound. And wounds don't respect walls. Below me, the shop hummed with the small sounds of 11 people sharing a space designed for one man and his table saw. Murmured conversation, a child coughing, the creak of a cot, the metallic sound of Frank checking the 4570's action. Normal sounds, domestic sounds, the sounds of a household that assembled itself around me without my consent, and now required me to hold it together with skills I didn't have. I could build a wall. I could frame a roof. I could calculate load-bearing requirements and shear strength and nail schedules. But I could not build the thing this group actually needed, which was trust. Trust isn't a structure. It's a climate. And I had no tools for climate control. The next morning, day 6, 4 more people arrived. 2 of them I knew. Danny Reese, who ran the auto body shop on Elm Street, and his teenage daughter Allie, 17. The other 2 were strangers, a man and a woman in their 30s who introduced themselves as Pete and Carmen, and said they'd driven from Mendota, 30 miles south, where the infected had arrived 2 days earlier than the model predicted. 15 people, 2 of them children, 1 of them a teenager, and 4 days left on my clock. Tom looked at me across the common area. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. By day 6 was when I lost the plan, not the physical plan. The shop was progressing on schedule, the barriers were solid, the observation post was functional, and the south wall reinforcement was 70% complete. What I lost was the strategic plan, the invisible architecture beneath the construction, the assumption that I was building a shelter for a defined number of people against a predictable timeline, and that the variables were manageable because they were material. 15 people changed everything, not because of resources, though Tom immediately revised the water calculus, and the result was grim, but because 15 people introduced social physics that overwhelmed my engineering. Alliances formed. Information channels bifurcated. Conversations happened in corners that stopped when I approached. The shop, which had been a workshop, became a polity, and polities operate on rules I was never trained to build. The split crystallized around an unlikely axis. Danny Reese. Danny was loud, physical, funny, and aggressively competent. He'd run his body shop for 20 years and managed a crew of 6 mechanics, which meant he understood group dynamics in a way I didn't. Not as theory, but as daily practice. Within hours of arriving, he'd assessed the power structure, identified the tensions, and begun building his own network of trust. He helped Gil reinforce the south wall, which earned Gil's loyalty. He told a joke that made Vera laugh, which softened Tom. He brought Allie to work beside Kaylee, and the two girls clicked with the instantaneous chemistry of teenagers thrown together by crisis. And he talked to Ray. Not about Lisa, not about grief. He talked to Ray about engines, about the Suburban's cracked windshield and whether the glass would hold, about fuel injection timing and compression ratios and the relative merits of Chevy's small block V8 versus Ford's Coyote. He talked to Ray about things that had nothing to do with the end of the world. And I watched Ray's hand stop shaking, for the first time, Lynette, in 3 days. I should have been grateful. I was jealous. The jealousy was specific and ugly. Danny was doing something for Ray that I had failed to do, and he was doing it effortlessly, and the group was watching, and the comparison was unflattering. I'd tried to manage Ray. Danny simply met him. I'd used Lisa's name as a lever. Danny never mentioned her. I was the builder. Danny was the human being. Pete and Carmen, the couple from Mendota, brought intelligence that reshaped our timeline. They'd driven through Bureau County on their way north and seen the infection front moving faster than the health department model predicted. Not because the infected were moving faster. Their foot speed was consistent, that eerie, smooth gait, but because the pattern had changed. They weren't advancing in a radial wavefront anymore. They were following roads. The interstate, Pete said. He was compact, dark-haired, precise. I-80. They're walking the median. Thousands of them. Single file like a migration. And where the highway intersects county roads, groups peel off and follow those. Like water following channels, Renee said. Exactly like that. And Route 30 intersects I-80 at Peru. That's 40 miles southeast. If they're following 30 westbound, they'll be here in 3 days, I said. Not 4. The clock had accelerated. The margin I'd been counting on, that comfortable buffer of extra time that allowed for mistakes and arguments and human messiness, evaporated in a single conversation. 3 days. Maybe 2. Tom pulled out his inventory list and began recalculating with a pencil that moved across the paper like a seismograph needle. Gil and Danny exchanged a look that communicated more than an hour of discussion. Frank, who'd been sitting silently in his corner cleaning the rifle, stood up and said, "I'll double the watch rotation." And Kaylee, my daughter, my beautiful, practical daughter, looked at me across the shop with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Not fear, not accusation, assessment. She was evaluating whether I was equal to what was coming. I wasn't sure I was. On the morning of day 7, Ray Purcell dismantled the south wall. Not all of it, but enough. He'd been awake since 3, moving with the quiet purposefulness of someone operating according to an internal logic that had decoupled from the group's consensus. He removed 18 screws from a plywood panel on the south barrier, the section that covered the emergency exit gap between the shop's steel frame and the original siding, and leaned the panel against the wall, creating a 3-foot opening to the outside. Frank found it at 5 during his perimeter walk. He woke me without waking the others. "South wall's been opened," he said. "And Ray's not in the building." I found Ray in the hayfield, standing 50 yards from the shop in the pre-dawn gray, facing east. He was holding a flashlight that was turned off. He was wearing his jacket but no shoes. "Ray, she's out there, Dale." The bottom dropped out of my stomach. "Lisa is gone, Ray." "Not gone. Changed." "That's different. The people on the road. They're still moving, still walking, still going somewhere. She's going somewhere. And if I could just find her." "Ray, listen to me. You don't understand. None of you understand. You keep acting like they're dead. They're not dead. They're moving differently, organized. That's not death. That's something else." And Lisa was smart. She was so smart. If anyone could... I grabbed his arm. Not hard, not aggressive. A connection, a tether. He looked at my hand on his arm, and then at my face, and something cleared in his eyes. Briefly, like a window wiped in fog. For 3 seconds, Ray Purcell was fully present, and what I saw in those 3 seconds was a man who knew exactly what he was doing and couldn't stop. "Help me," he whispered. I walked him back to the shop. Kaylee was awake, holding Mia, who had woken to find her father missing and was crying with the restrained, hiccuping sobs of a child who has learned that loud grief draws attention she doesn't want. Jay sat on his cot with his arms crossed and his jaws set, and in that 10-year-old face, I saw an expression I recognized from the mirror. A person carrying more weight than they were built for and compensating with rigidity. Tom was waiting inside. He'd seen the open panel. He'd counted the missing screws. He'd already formulated his position. And he delivered it in the common area with the group assembled, Ray sitting on a crate with his children pressed against him. He compromised the barrier. At night, while we were sleeping, one open panel for 1 hour, and anything on the south side had direct access to 15 people, including 2 children. "He's not well," Renee said. "This isn't a disciplinary issue, Tom. It's a mental health crisis. It's both. And the mental health crisis is creating a security crisis that I'm not willing to absorb." "What are you proposing?" Danny asked from the back of the room, his voice neutral, controlled. Tom hesitated. He knew what he was proposing. He didn't want to be the one to say it. "He needs to go to the house," Tom said. "Not outside, not away. The house, 30 yards from here, with his kids if he wants. We check on him. We feed him. But he's not inside the barrier anymore." "You're exiling him," I said. "I'm separating a compromised individual from the group." "He's not an individual, Tom. He's a father with 2 children who just watched him walk into a field in his socks looking for his dead wife. Mia is 7 years old. You want to explain to her why she can't sleep where the other people sleep?" The silence that followed was the heaviest thing I'd ever felt in that shop. Heavier than lumber, heavier than steel, heavier than the plywood sheets we'd been hauling for a week. It was the silence of a group realizing that 2 people had made valid arguments that could not coexist. Ray spoke. His voice was thin and precise. "I'll go to the house. The kids stay here." "Absolutely not," Marguerite said. "Renee, I mean. Those children stay with their father. Those children are safer here. And I'm..." He stopped. He looked at Mia. He looked at Jace. "Tom is right. I don't trust myself right now." That admission cost him everything he had left. I could see the price in the way he stood afterward, slowly, using the crate for support, as though his body had become heavier in the time it took to speak the truth. I walked Ray to the house myself. He carried a sleeping bag, a water jug, and nothing else. The house was unlocked. I'd stopped locking it when the shop became the primary shelter. Inside, it still smelled like sawdust and coffee, the permanent aroma of my half-finished life. "The bedroom has a door," I said. "The bathroom doesn't, but..." "I know your house, Dale. I've been to your barbecues." A ghost of a smile, the first expression on his face that referenced a time before. "I'll bring food every 4 hours. Check on you." "Don't check on me. That makes me a patient. Just bring the food and leave." I agreed. I left, walking back across the 30 yards of gravel between the house and the shop. I felt something tearing inside my chest, not guilt exactly, but the visceral recognition that I had just participated in an act of exclusion that was simultaneously necessary and cruel, and that no amount of justification would make it feel like the right thing. Jace and Mia stayed in the shop. Kaylee became their gravity, and she accepted the role without visible hesitation. But that night, after the children were asleep, she found me at the observation post and said something that recalibrated my understanding of my own daughter. "You should let Danny lead." "I'm not leading." "Yes, you are. Badly. You're leading because you're building, and people equate construction with authority. But building isn't leading. Danny knows how to manage people. You know how to manage materials. Those aren't the same thing. Danny's been here 2 days, and in 2 days, he's done more for the group's cohesion than you've done in 7. Dad, I love you. You're the reason this shelter exists. But you put Ray in the house by himself because Tom pressured you, and you didn't know how to push back. Danny would have found a different solution." She was right. She was 19 years old, and she was right, and the pain of hearing it was matched only by the clarity it produced. I was a shop teacher. I was good at building things and teaching people to build things. I was not good at navigating the emotional trigonometry of 15 people trapped in a steel box with diminishing time and growing fear. Danny was, not because he was smarter or braver, but because his intelligence was social in a way mine had never been. "I'll talk to him," I said. "Don't talk to him. Just stop deciding things. Let the group figure out who they trust. It's already happening. You're just in the way." She went back to the sleeping area. I stood at the observation post and looked through the reinforced slit at the empty hayfield and the county road beyond it. Frank was out there, somewhere in the dark, walking his perimeter, carrying his rifle, performing the one function that required no social skill. Watching. I envied him. The next morning, day 8. 2 things happened simultaneously. The power went out, this time permanently, and the first infected walked onto my property. Frank saw it from the east edge of the perimeter, a single figure coming through the hayfield from the direction of the county road, moving in that characteristic smooth gait, male, middle-aged, wearing khaki pants and a polo shirt, Morrison clothes, Morrison body type. It could have been any man from any church pew or hardware store in town. It walked to within 20 yards of the shop, stopped and stood, facing the overhead door, motionless. Frank radioed from the porch. "1 contact, east side, stationary. Not approaching, just standing." Danny came to the observation post and looked. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the group. All 15 of them, plus the 2 kids, awake now, watching, waiting for someone to speak. "Everyone stay calm," Danny said. "Dale, what's the overhead door rated for?" "Steel panel, insulated, motor-driven but operable by hand. I reinforced the tracks with angle iron. Will it hold? Against 1? Easily. Against more?" I looked through the slit at the solitary figure in the field. It stood with the patience of a fence post. No urgency, no aggression, just presence. And behind it, on the county road, I could see others. Not 1 or 2, not a dozen. A column walking west, following the road the way Pete had described. Water in a channel. "I don't know," I said. Danny didn't take leadership. He absorbed it. There was no announcement, no vote, no dramatic moment of transfer. What happened was subtler and more organic. He started making decisions that the group followed, and I stopped making decisions that competed with his. On day 8, with the power dead and a sentinel standing in my field, Danny reorganized the shop. He assigned roles based on capability rather than volunteerism, a distinction I'd never made. Gil and Frank took security, alternating 4-hour watches with clear protocols. Observe, report, do not engage unless directly threatened. Renee took medical responsibility, inventorying the first aid supplies and establishing a triage protocol that nobody wanted to think about, but everyone needed. Tom managed resources, water, food, materials, and his clipboard became the ledger of our survival rather than the instrument of his control. Pete and Carmen took communications, monitoring the battery-powered radio for any signal that might indicate organized response. And me, Danny gave me the one job I was genuinely qualified for: building. The overhead door is the weak point, he said. How fast can you reinforce it? With what? The power's out. My table saw, my drill press, my welder. Everything runs on electricity. Hand tools. I looked at my shop. A shop of 20 years equipping with power tools, the best of everything, professional grade. And I reclassified every piece of equipment in it. Useless. The table saw was furniture now. The drill press was a coat rack. 2 decades of investment reduced to dead weight by the absence of a current. What I had left: hand saws, chisels, a brace-and-bit hand drill, hammers, a manual come-along winch, and the knowledge of how to use all of them. The knowledge was the power tool now. 12 hours, I said. I need Gil and 2x6s. You have both. Gil and I worked the overhead door reinforcement through the day while the sentinels stood in the field, and the column continued its migration along the county road. The door was steel, but the tracks were aluminum, and aluminum under lateral pressure was my concern. We sistered 2x6s along both tracks, lag-bolted into the concrete slab, creating a wooden exoskeleton that transferred any inward force directly to the foundation. It was crude compared to what I could have built with power tools. It was also solid. Load-bearing doesn't care about aesthetics. While we worked, Danny did something I wouldn't have done. He went to the house and brought Ray back. Not into the shop, into the yard, into the work. He gave Ray a handsaw and a stack of lumber and told him to cut reinforcement braces to a specific length, 26 inches, 45-degree angle on each end. Simple, repetitive, physical work that required focus without judgment. Ray cut braces for 6 hours. His hands didn't shake. His eyes stayed on the blade. Mia watched from the observation post slit. And when Ray looked up and saw her face in the narrow opening, he raised one hand in a wave that contained more communication than any sentence I'd heard him speak in a week. You brought him back, I said to Danny during a break. He wasn't gone. You just put him somewhere you couldn't see him. The sentence hit me like a 2x4 to the chest. Not because it was cruel. Danny didn't deliver it with cruelty, but because it was precisely, structurally accurate. I had removed Ray from the space, not because he was unsafe, but because his unsafety was visible, and visibility was the thing I couldn't manage. Out of sight was out of scope, a builder's solution to a human problem. Tom won't like it, I said. Tom doesn't decide who matters. That evening, the sentinel in the field was joined by 2 others. They stood in a loose triangle, equidistant, facing the shop. Frank reported them with his usual neutrality. 3 contacts, stationary, 30-yard spread. No approach behavior. Danny gathered the group. They're not attacking. They're waiting. I've seen cats do this outside a mouse hole. The question is what they're waiting for. Concentration, Liam, Jace said. 10 years old, sitting cross-legged on the floor with his mother's absence written across his shoulders. They're waiting for more of them. They don't go in alone. Danny looked at the boy. How do you know that? Because the one at our house waited too. It waited until there were more. Then they went in. The common area went silent. Jace had just told us how his mother died, and he'd told us with the analytical detachment of a child who has converted grief into data in order to survive. I watched Danny process this, watched him choose, in real time, to honor the intelligence without excavating the trauma. Then we need to be ready before they reach that number, Danny said. Dale, how long to reinforce the south wall and seal the emergency exit? With hand tools, 2 days. You have one. I worked through the night. Gil stayed with me until midnight. Then Danny sent Allie Reese to replace him. 17 years old, Danny's daughter, with her father's competence and a reserve of physical energy that left me feeling every one of my 44 years. She held lumber while I drilled. She braced panels while I hammered. She didn't talk much, but when she did, it was to ask questions about joinery and load transfer that told me she'd been watching me work for days and learning. You'd be good in my class, I told her at 2 in the morning, fitting a cross brace into the emergency exit frame. My dad says the same thing. He says I build things the way other people read books. I see the structure before I see the pieces. That's a gift. It's attention. Same thing my dad does with cars. He hears the engine and knows which cylinder is misfiring before he opens the hood. You look at a wall and know which joint is carrying the load. Your dad's good at people too. She paused, holding a 2x4 against the frame. He's good at reading what people need. That's not the same as being good at people. He's actually terrible at people. Ask his ex-wife. Ask my mom. But in a crisis, reading need is more valuable than being likable. It was the most sophisticated interpersonal analysis I'd heard from anyone in the group, and it came from a teenager. I thought about Kaylee's assessment of me. Accurate, painful, necessary. And I thought about Allie's assessment of Danny, and I realized that the daughters were seeing their fathers more clearly than the fathers were seeing themselves. By dawn on day 9, the south wall was sealed. Not pretty. The hand-cut joints were rough, the braces were visible, the screw head stood proud of the surface, because I didn't have time to countersink, but it was solid. I pushed against it with my full weight, and it didn't flex. I kicked the base panel, and the impact transferred into the slab without displacement. It would hold. The perimeter had grown overnight. Frank counted 11 sentinels now, arranged in a wider arc that extended from the hayfield to the edge of the county road. They stood in that loose, equidistant spacing, 30 yards apart, motionless, facing the shop. The column on the road continued its westward migration, but individuals were peeling off and joining the perimeter with increasing frequency. A tributary feeding a reservoir. Danny held a morning briefing in the common area. He stood at the center of the group, and I stood at the edge, and the geometric reversal of our positions was not lost on me. I'd started at the center, building outward. He'd started at the edge, building inward. His architecture was social. Mine was physical. The shelter needed both, but in this moment, his mattered more. We have 1 day of timeline left, Danny said. The perimeter is growing. They're not attacking yet, but the pattern Jace described suggests a threshold, a number they reach before they move. We don't know that number. Could be 20, could be 50. What are our options? Renee asked. 3. We stay and defend. We leave and run. Or we do something nobody's considered. Which is? Danny paused. This was the moment he'd been building toward, and I could see the cost of it in his posture. The slight forward lean, the hands open at his sides, the deliberate vulnerability of a man about to propose something he wasn't sure of. We bring Ray back inside, give him a radio, and send him to the house. Not as exile, as a forward observer. He positions on the second floor with a sight line to the entire perimeter. He counts, he reports, he tracks their movement. He becomes our eyes. Tom started to object. Danny cut him off. Ray is the best person for this job because he's the one with the least to lose. He knows it. I've already talked to him. He volunteered. I looked at Danny Reese, a man I'd known for 6 days, and I understood that he had done something I'd been unable to do. He'd found a way to give Ray a function that honored his damage instead of hiding it. The man who walked into fields at night looking for his dead wife was now the man who watched the field for everyone. The wound had been converted into a weapon. His kids, Marguerite. Renee said, stay here, with Kaylee, where they're safe. And if the house is overrun? Danny looked at me. I looked at the south wall I just finished reinforcing. Then we open the south wall, and we bring him home. Ray took position in the house at noon on day 9. He carried the battery-powered radio, a pair of binoculars Frank had produced from somewhere in his jacket, and the .45-70, which Frank gave up with a reluctance that expressed itself as a 10-minute tutorial on ammunition conservation and sight adjustment. 1 round, 1 report, Frank told him. Don't waste it, don't hesitate, and don't aim for the head. Center mass. If it doesn't stop them, nothing will. But the sound will tell us. Ray nodded. He looked at Jace and Mia, who stood at the observation post watching him walk across the gravel. He didn't wave this time. He held their eyes for a long count, and then he turned and went inside. His first report came 20 minutes later. 14 contacts visible from the 2nd floor, spacing unchanged. No movement toward either structure. Wait, one is moving. Northeast quadrant. It just took 3 steps toward the road and stopped. We listened to Ray's reports through the afternoon. His voice was steady, clinical, transformed. The man who couldn't hold a flashlight without trembling was now delivering tactical intelligence with the precision of a surveyor. Whatever was broken in Ray had found, not a repair, but a channel, a way to pour itself into something functional. By evening, his count was 22. Danny and I stood at the observation post together as the light failed. The sentinels were shadows now, indistinguishable from fence posts or tree stumps if you didn't know where to look. But Ray knew where each one stood. His map was verbal, delivered over the radio in a continuous low narration that Renee transcribed onto a sketch of the property. You built a good shelter, Dale. I didn't respond immediately. The compliment felt loaded. Not insincere, but complex, carrying secondary freight. You built a good shelter, Danny repeated, and now it needs to be more than a shelter. It needs to be a home. Not forever, for tonight. And the difference between a shelter and a home is that a home has people in it who trust each other. Do they trust each other? They trust the structure. That's your doing. They're starting to trust the organization. That's mine. The gap is between the two. The place where Tom's fear lives, where Ray's grief lives, where your pride lives. My pride. He named it without flinching, the way you name a load-bearing wall that needs to come down for the renovation to work. What do you need from me? I asked. Keep building, but build what I ask for, not what you think we need. Can you do that? The question was simple. The answer cost me something I can't precisely name. Not authority, because I'd never truly had it, but the illusion of authority, which had been load-bearing in a way I hadn't recognized until it was removed. Yes. Good. Because tomorrow, we're either going to be attacked or we're going to have to make a choice about whether to stay. What kind of choice? Pete picked up a military broadcast 2 hours ago. There's a staging area being established at Camp Lincoln in Springfield. National Guard, FEMA, organized intake. They're calling for civilian groups to move toward designated corridors for evacuation. The corridor for northern Illinois runs along Route 34 through Mendota and Princeton. That's east. The infected are coming from the east. The corridor runs between the migration columns, not against them. Pete says the military is using the infected's road-following behavior to predict gaps, windows of clear passage between columns. You want us to leave. I want us to have the option, which means I need you to build something I've never asked a shop teacher to build before. What? A mobile barrier. Something we can put on the truck that lets 15 people ride in a protected bed through 30 miles of open road. Not armor, not a tank. Just enough to keep us enclosed and invisible for 60 minutes. I looked at the shop. My shop, tools, my lumber, my steel. And I saw for the first time, not what I'd built, but what it could become. Not a fortress, a vehicle. Not a destination, but a departure. I can do that, I said. But I need everyone, including Ray. Day 10. The last day of my clock. The day the math said the infection wave front would reach Lee County. And the math was right. Frank woke us at 5:15 with 3 words on the radio. "They're moving." I was at the observation post in seconds. The Sentinels, 31 now, by Ray's dawn count, had broken their static formation. They were walking. Not toward the shop, not toward the house. They were walking in a circle. A slow, wide orbit around both structures, maintaining their equidistant spacing but now in motion, processing counterclockwise like a living carousel. The effect was hypnotic and terrifying. A ring of smooth-gated figures describing a perimeter that tightened with each revolution, by a margin so slight that only Ray, from his elevated position, could measure it. "Circumference decreasing," Ray reported. "Approximately 2 feet per cycle. At current rate, they reach the shop wall in..." A pause. 16 hours. We had 16 hours. Or less, if the count increased, if the rate accelerated, if the behavior shifted from orbiting to approaching. Danny had prepared for this. He'd briefed the group the night before on the evacuation option, and the vote, the first democratic act of our small polity, had been 12-3 in favor of attempting the corridor to Springfield. The 3 dissenting votes were Tom, Frank, and Gil. Tom believed the shelter was defensible. Frank didn't trust the military broadcast. Gil didn't trust anything he hadn't built with his own hands, which was perhaps the most honest position of all. But the vote was the vote, and Danny honored it, and the dissenters accepted it with varying degrees of visible discomfort. Democracy in a steel box, imperfect, binding, better than the alternative. I'd been building the mobile barrier since midnight. The concept was simple: a plywood and 2x4 enclosure bolted to the F-250's bed, tall enough to shield seated passengers, reinforced at stress points, with a narrow forward slit for the driver's visibility. It was an ugly, beautiful, desperate piece of work. I used every remaining sheet of 3/4-inch plywood, every 2x6, every lag bolt. The hand drill screamed under the torque. My palms blistered, and the blisters broke, and I kept drilling because there wasn't time for skin. Allie worked beside me through the night. So did Gil, despite his dissenting vote. So did Jace, who held bolts and fetched tools with a solemn efficiency that broke my heart and rebuilt it in the same motion. And so did Ray, who walked from the house at 1 a.m. carrying the 45-70 and a calm I'd never seen on him before. "You left your post," I said. "Mia asked me to help you build." He set the rifle down and picked up a hammer. "She said you were building a boat for the mobile barrier. A 7-year-old's interpretation of a plywood box on a truck bed. She wasn't wrong. We were building a vessel to carry us across a sea of things that wanted to drown us." By dawn, it was done. The enclosure sat on the truck bed like a coffin with windows, claustrophobic, tight, but structurally sound. I'd tested the joints by hanging my full weight from the crossbeams. Nothing gave. The forward slit was narrow enough to minimize exposure while allowing the driver a functional field of view. The rear panel was hinged for rapid loading. Danny inspected it. He ran his hands along the joints, pushed the walls, tested the bolts. Then he turned to me and said, "This is the best thing you've ever built." I knew he was wrong. The best thing I'd ever built was the pergola Teresa never sat under. The one I designed as an anniversary gift, with curved cedar rafters and hand-turned columns, before our marriage collapsed, and the pergola became a monument to something unfinished. But Danny didn't mean craftsmanship. He meant function. He meant a thing built in 10 hours with hand tools and bleeding palms that would carry 15 people through 30 miles of apocalypse. He meant the work mattered because the people mattered, and the people mattered because they were here and they were alive, and the only thing between them and the circling dark was a shop teacher's hands. "Load up," Danny said. "We leave in 30 minutes." Loading was choreography. Danny had assigned positions the night before. Who sat where, who carried what, who entered in what order. The children went in first. Mia lifted by Kaylee, Jace climbing in under his own power with his backpack pressed against his chest. Then Marguerite. Vera, whose bruised foot had improved enough to walk, but not to run. Then Carmen, then Pete, then Renee with the medical kit. Then Sophie, who had barely spoken in 10 days, but whose physical composure under pressure had been a silent anchor for everyone around her. Tom went in last. He stood at the tailgate with his inventory clipboard, the one he'd carried since day 2, the one that contained every resource calculation, every water measurement, every food count. And he set it on the ground. "Don't need it anymore," he said. He climbed in and pulled the hinged panels shut. In the cab, Danny driving, Frank in the passenger seat with the 4570, me in the middle. Behind us, in the enclosed bed, 13 people in a plywood box, trusting a structure I'd built with hand tools, and trusting a plan Danny had built with intuition, and trusting a military corridor that Pete had located on a dying radio. Ray was not in the truck. He appeared at the driver's window as Danny started the engine. He leaned in, and his face was the face I remembered from the barbecues. Present, alive, composed. "I'll follow in the Suburban," he said. "If you break down, you'll need a second vehicle." Ray. "My kids are in your truck, Dale. I'm not letting that truck travel alone." Danny looked at me. I looked at Danny. "Follow close," Danny said. "If we stop, you stop. If we move, you move. Do not get separated." Understood. We pulled out of the driveway at 6:42 in the morning, 10 days after I'd first read the health department map, with the circling sentinels 30 yards from the shop wall and closing, as we reached the county road and turned east, into the direction I'd spent 10 days preparing to defend against. I looked in the side mirror and saw the Suburban behind us, Ray's face visible through the cracked windshield. And behind the Suburban, my shop, my house, my 4 acres, the pergola Teresa never sat under, and the 31 figures that had already begun to converge on the structures we'd left behind. We drove east on Route 30 at 40 miles per hour, fast enough to cover ground, slow enough to stop for obstacles. The road was debris-strewn but unpassable. Abandoned vehicles dotted the shoulders. Danny navigated around them with a mechanic's spatial awareness, reading each wreck for information. How long ago it stopped, which direction it was heading, whether the doors were open or closed. The migration columns Pete had described were visible from the highway, parallel lines of infected, walking the median of I-80, visible from the overpass at Mendota, thousands of them, moving east to west, smooth and synchronized. We crossed the overpass, and I held my breath, watching for any deviation, any head turn, any indication that our passage had been detected. Nothing. They walked. We drove. 2 species sharing the same geography, separated by speed and 70 feet of vertical distance. The corridor held. 30 miles of road, 2 military checkpoints manned by National Guard soldiers who looked simultaneously relieved and terrified to see civilians alive. They checked us for bites. They gave us water. They pointed us south toward Springfield. At the second checkpoint, a sergeant with sunburn and 3 days of beard looked at the plywood enclosure on my truck bed and said, "Who built that?" "I did," I said. "You military?" "I'm a shop teacher." He stared at me for a moment. Then he said, "We need shop teachers," and waved us through. We reached Camp Lincoln at 2 in the afternoon. Tents, fences, generators, a medical station, a line of civilians stretching a quarter mile. Organized chaos. Structured desperation. I parked the truck and opened the rear panel and watched 13 people climb out of the box I'd built, blinking in the sunlight, stretching limbs that had been compressed for 3 hours. Alive. Mia came out last, carried by Kaylee, and when her feet touched the ground, she looked up at the plywood walls of the enclosure and said, "Thank you, boat." Ray pulled the Suburban in behind us. He got out, walked to the truck, and his children ran to him. He knelt and held them and said nothing. And the nothing was everything. Danny found me standing by the truck an hour later. After the intake processing, after the medical checks, after Tom surrendered his inventory clipboard to a logistics officer who actually needed one. "You okay?" "No," I said. "But the walls are." He put his hand on my shoulder briefly, and then walked away to find Allie. "The shop is gone. I know this because I know the math. 31 converging at 2 feet per cycle, and nobody left inside to defend it. The tools, the table saw, the pergola, all of it absorbed into whatever the sentinels do when they reach the center of their circle. I don't think about it as loss. I think about it as material returned to the site. At Camp Lincoln, they put me to work building shelters, military spec frames with civilian finishes, designed to house families in 32 square foot units. I build them with hand tools because the generators are reserved for medical and communications. My hands have healed into new shapes, thicker, harder, mapped with scars that weren't there 3 weeks ago. Kaylee runs the intake registration. Sophie assists in medical. Tom manages supply distribution and has never been happier. Frank walks the perimeter. Some things don't change. Danny leads a civilian coordination team. I build what he asks me to build. The arrangement is correct. It always was. I just couldn't see it from the center. Ray works the watchtower on the east wall. His children sleep in the unit I built beside mine. Some mornings, Mia knocks on my door and says, "The boat builder is awake." I am awake. I build things. The things I build are not mine. That turns out to be the point.